Now, after the state visit of the Chinese leader to Moscow, what have we learned about the trajectory of the China-Russia relationship, considering the statements about ever-intensified friendship and partnership that Xi and Putin made in Moscow?
Yeah, I think what we've really learned is essentially that the trajectory that this relationship was already on is not going to change. I mean, this was very much a message in which she provided some personal statements of support for Vladimir Putin, including the interesting one of saying that he's sure that he'll win re-election in 2024, when Putin himself hasn't even said that he'll be standing, though we have our suspicions. But more to the point, behind that, there was actually very little that didn't actually suit China's interests. We had a whole new series of energy deals, which again, very much what China wants. It wants cheap and reliable energy from Russia. It's not doing the Russians any favors. It's buying what it needs at a price it's very happy to pay. We had general statements about the beginnings of something new, a new world order, which essentially means a non-Western world order in which obviously Beijing will be the key player. And beyond that, what we actually had was in many ways an absence of any commitment to providing particular support to Russia in its war with Ukraine, an absence of a willingness to actually recognize the annexations in explicit terms. Instead, we had Putin saying fine things about the Chinese peace plan, which is not a peace plan. It's just a general sort of collection of broad statements about why sovereignty is a good thing and Cold War thinking ought to be avoided. But essentially what this means is that China got everything it wanted and Russia very little in return, except, and it is no minor thing, except for a sort of a broad statement of support, particularly because this came so closely after the International Criminal Court arrest warrant on Putin. This is actually just simply a statement of saying, we are not abandoning you, we are just not helping you that much.
Mark, regarding the ICC decision and the warrant, what do you actually make of it? And do you think that in the context of Xi's visit, there were careful considerations in China and second thoughts about, say, not coming to Russia and changing the trajectory with regards to this particular decision?
I mean, all I can say is I didn't see any evidence that the Chinese actually had any qualms. Remember, the Chinese are also not signatories to the International Criminal Court. They don't recognize its judgments. And again, I think very much, if we put Xi's visit in the context of a wider Chinese campaign to basically create an alternative world order to one that they regard as the West's world order. Well, the ICC is very, very much a part of the West's world order, even though, ironically enough, the United States is also not a signatory to the court's foundational principles. So I think, in that context, I doubt they really worried too much about it. It's just that in terms of the kind of the convenience and the coincidence of these two things, it really, I think, emphasized the degree to which we are seeing a breaking apart of many of the sort of the foundational structures of the global order.
Mark, when ICC issued its warrant to arrest the Russian president, you noted that politics is about gestures, but it's also about impact. ICC clearly made a grand gesture. And what do you think about impact of this decision?
I'm a little concerned, actually, about the impact. Look, realistically speaking, it's extraordinarily unlikely that Vladimir Putin or indeed Maria Lvova-Belova will find themselves in the dock in The Hague. It only really happens in the context of failed and collapsing states, rulers who are toppled and the like. On the other hand, I mean, what this might conceivably do is actually make it harder in the longer term to end this war. I mean, at the moment, we're in a situation in which neither Russia nor Ukraine has any kind of meaningful basis for negotiations with each other. But that will have to change in due course. Perhaps the Ukrainians will make major advances on the battlefield, or indeed the Russians will demonstrate that they can't be dislodged from Zaporizhia and Donbass and such like. One way or the other, there will eventually be talks. And if Putin is convinced that in some ways he will continue to be a pariah on the global stage, then in some ways he has fewer reasons to actually talk. He may well think, well, what's the point? We can just continue this as a forever war. So this is my concern. And look, it's not the ICC's job to play geopolitics. And this is actually a court. It is there just simply to respond to what it sees as the facts and the cases that are brought to it. But nonetheless, speaking as someone who is more interested in the geopolitics, my concern is this might make things harder, because it's quite interesting. The people who most fiercely welcomed the arrest warrant were, on the whole, people who precisely want to see Putin and the Russian regime, and indeed in some cases the Russian state, pushed out of the global order and treated as if it is some kind of Mordor with which no one can make any kind of deals. I see why people may feel that, but the point is that is not the way to reach any kind of eventual peace.
That was my question, just as a short follow-up when it comes to the mechanics of how these decisions are made. If the decision is altering the prospects of peace so much, and if we just assume that ICC's decisions are not made without certain coordination with Western agencies, stakeholders, do we assume that the appetite for ending this war is pretty much non-existent right now in the West?
No, I certainly wouldn't want to play too much into it. My impression is, and who knows, yes, of course, there is some degree of behind the scenes conversations that take place with, as you say, stakeholders. But my impression is very much that the ICC should be considered to be an independent body. And that, although there may be more activist members of the court than others, and it's interesting that, for example, the Russians made quite a bit of play about the fact that the current president of the court is a Pole, and very much framing this as some kind of sort of Polish conspiracy against Moscow. In practice, it does seem to be a pretty independent body. So I think in this respect, no, there's a danger in reading too much into it. And frankly, some of the conversations I've had since with people in Western government structures suggest that they are actually aware of and slightly uncomfortable about the fact that this might make the war harder to end in due course.
Mark, if we go back for a little bit to the Chinese theme and the China-Russia relationship, we saw just this morning the headlines saying that, and suggestions in the press, in the Western press, suggesting that now after the visit, it became clear that China's domination of Russia is complete. Do you share this outlook?
No, I think it's way too early to make such statements. Look, has the balance of power shifted? Absolutely. I mean, anyway, it was changing because, Russia is in many ways a state that is trying desperately to hold on to what it has, whereas China is absolutely still a state on the rise. But nonetheless, I think that, to assume that somehow, Russia has been turned into a vassal of China is very premature. First of all, look, yes, of course, there is a certain sort of economic gravity that sucks Russia into China's orbit, especially at the moment, given that Russia is denied a lot of its other markets. But just because you deal with and trade with and sell your goods to one country does not actually mean you have absolute power over them. Remember, this was exactly the fallacy we heard before, when the idea was that Putin had this kind of extraordinary magical energy weapon that just simply by turning off the gas, he could force Europe to bend to his will. And it didn't happen. Well, likewise, I mean, actually, what's happening is the danger is, if anything, China is following the same pattern as Germany, in that its economy becomes addicted to cheap Russian energy. And this means that, yes, in theory, Beijing could say to Russia, we will stop buying your energy, your oil and your gas, which would obviously have a massive impact on Russia. But the point is that will also have a massive impact on China, because you can't just magically create new sources, or at least not affordable, cheap and reliable new sources. So in some ways, what we're actually seeing is a kind of a growing interconnectedness rather than just simply one country being dominant. The second point I'd make is, look, Putin himself clearly is consumed by his current struggle with Ukraine, and through that with the West as a whole. This is going to be the struggle, the conflict, the war that defines his presidency, and probably will also determine his political future. And I think, therefore, he's not really interested in anything else. He has to make whatever deals he has to make with China. Fine, he'll do them. it's clear there are many others within the Russian elite, especially the sort of the waiting political generation, the 50-something-year-olds, the early 60-something-year-olds, who are actually much, much more cautious and worried about China because precisely they're operating on a different kind of timeline. And I think these are people who, in due course, they will become dominant within the system. And I think they will actually not want to become part of a sort of a wider Chinese informal empire, and they will push against that. So this is not an end of a story. And the final point I'd make, and I apologize for giving such a long answer, is that also, even if it looks like Russia is now part of China's sphere of influence, look, we've seen from empires, whether we're talking about the Roman Empire or the Tsarist Empire or the Soviet Empire, that in fact, actually you have much less control over the smaller countries that are notionally in your dominion than you may think. They will turn around and they will lie to you and abuse you and use you for their own interests. That happened to Moscow often enough, and I see no reason why Moscow would not do the same to Beijing.
This is very interesting, Mark. Since we're interested in geopolitics, and geopolitics imply a lot of kind of conspiracy theories and speculations about different things. We know that the growing war in Russia in the last decade was this kind of quiet inundation and quiet annexation, if we may say, by China of the eastern territories of Russia. And right before Xi's visit to Moscow, the Ministry of Natural Resources of China has issued a new regulation on the geographic maps. I found it pretty curious. And now it's required that the old Chinese names are given to the Russian cities that were, taken by Russia in the 19th century. And we are finding out that Vladivostok will now be called Hashenwai, and Sakhalin Island will be called Kuyedao for the internal Chinese purposes. Do we make anything special of this move and of its timing?
I mean, I'm not sure about what the timing necessarily. Again, there's a danger of reading too much into things. But no, but broadly speaking, I mean, this absolutely reflects the fact that, ironically, ever since the COVID years, China has become much, much more aggressive and assertive on the international scene. And we see this in every direction. I mean, not just in terms of its notional allies like Russia, but particularly also we see it with the West. I mean, this is a China that clearly seems to feel that its time has come or is coming. And this manifests itself in a nationalist wave. And does this necessarily mean that China will want to revisit the treaties, which it regards as unfair treaties, which saw Chinese lands passed to Russia, I mean, in previous centuries? Someday it may. But the point is that, look, at the moment, I don't think there's any question of any kind of sort of aggressive attempt to take Russian territories at the moment. China doesn't need to. China basically can buy everything it wants. If it wants Russian timber for its construction boom, if it wants the waters of Lake Baikal to meet its needs, whatever it wants, it can basically buy a lot more cheaply than fighting a war with what is, after all, still a nuclear power. And let's be perfectly honest, one of the reasons why Russia retains its nuclear power, beyond obviously the prestige it gives it, the seat at the United Nations Security Council and so forth, is actually not because of NATO. Because there is no real belief that NATO is actually able, let alone willing, to launch an aggressive war to the West. It's actually because the only way that Russia could actually repel a Chinese invasion is with strategic or non-strategic nuclear weapons. And that's a very, very open secret, shall we say. So I think in this context, I mean, I don't think we're going to see China getting aggressive in that way, but it speaks to this wider aggression within China, this wider sense of nationalism and confidence. And that is also something that is being noticed in Russia. I mean, and I think it's quite interesting the degree to which both in Moscow, but also actually in the Russian Far East, in Vladivostok, in Khabarovsk and so forth, we are getting more and more people commenting that on the one hand, yes, they want the Chinese money, but on the other hand, they are worried about the implications of a rising Chinese power.
Mark, I'm turning to your latest book that, as I mentioned, read like a fascinating novel. And I want to give a quote about Russian-China relationship. And it basically says, Western leaders are clearly worried by what they see as a burgeoning Sino-Russian Dragon Bear military alliance. And in the last week, we heard multitude of warnings from the Western leaders, including the one from the NATO General Secretary just at the beginning of this week, cautioning China against providing military supplies to Russia to fight in Ukraine. And Beijing has been very clearly kind of unnerved and irritated by these warnings, because it was repeated several times by the Chinese diplomats that they're not intending to supply Russia with lethal aid. At the same time, Xi in Moscow says that friendship with Moscow is growing day by day. Is this statement by itself a product of the Western pressure on China? And does it mean that China is not excluding the option of supplying military aid, lethal aid, for Russia to fight in Ukraine?
In many ways, I think Xi's words are an alternative to actually providing any real assistance. Kind words instead of drones and ammunition, which is clearly what Moscow wants. Look, I think it's very clear that from China's point of view, it is willing to support Russia's political position about an aggressive NATO and such like, but it's not willing in any way to actually risk finding itself in an economic and political confrontation with the West. And it's worth noting, after all, that for every dollar of trade that China does with Russia, it does between $8 and $9 of trade with North America and Europe. And it's certainly not going to jeopardize that for Russia. And therefore, I think this is what we've seen up to now. We've seen a little flow of small arms, dual-use technologies, which have a civil purpose and yet can also be used militarily. But even then, they're not actually sold directly. They tend to be exported via countries like Turkey and the United Arab Emirates into Russia. There's a certain turning of a blind eye. There's Russian money laundering, state money laundering that goes on through Chinese banks and the like. However, China itself as a state is clearly not willing to take that kind of a step in support of the Russians. And I think the West probably actually overreacted because, again, the Chinese tend to be very, very prickly about their dignity. And I think all these statements clearly meant to warn the Chinese off just in case, but nonetheless, obviously hit a particular sort of neuralgic point for the Chinese. But even so, look, I think at present, the kind of assistance that the Chinese are providing is political, and it is in terms of indirect support to the Russian economy. We may, in due course, see some Chinese artillery shells being provided to the Russians, probably through North Korea, because there's stories about the Russians trying to buy artillery shells off North Korea. Well, many of those might actually originate from Chinese factories. So that's kind of another way around it. But this is all pretty small scale compared to what Putin really was hoping for from Beijing.
Just to this statement, again, I'm quoting from your book. It says, it's unsurprising that unofficially Moscow has clearly been less than impressed with the Beijing's response to its war in Ukraine. On the other hand, were China and the United States to clash over Taiwan, then Beijing might expect Moscow to provide at least political and intelligence support, if not something more substantial. What could that be that Beijing might be expecting from Moscow, and would Moscow be ready to chime in the conflict of China and United States over Taiwan in the hopes to receive more help with its own struggle in Ukraine?
Realistically, at the moment, there's a limit to quite what Russia could provide, other than just simply another vote at the United Nations and a certain sort of amount of propaganda or whatever. There is, of course, the Russian Pacific Fleet, but it's not in a particularly good shape at the moment, especially because obviously its Marines have largely been raided for extra troops to send to Ukraine. But nonetheless, they could deploy as a sort of symbolic show of support in support of the Chinese, which would, in case of a conflict, force the Americans to at least devote a certain amount of their maritime power just to head that off in case the Russians mean business. I think it's worth noting that at the moment, although there's clearly a sort of a concern about the Chinese thinking of this as an opportunity to sort of seize the moment when the West is preoccupied with Europe, there's very little signs that at present the Chinese are planning a military attack. It's more that I think it speaks to the essential sort of dynamic of the relationship between Beijing and Moscow, which is on the one hand, on the surface, very, very positive and all about this sort of great friendship without limits and such like. That was interesting. I mean, that was a phrase that was used in the past. Putin used that phrase, the friendship without limits, during Xi's visit to Moscow. Xi very pointedly did not. So there is a lot of sort of public fulsomeness, but in private, it's very transactional. In practice, these are not real allies. These are countries that, shall we say, have the same, if not enemy, but rival, and at times will see common interests, but they really do not have a common vision of the world. Russia does not want to get involved in a Chinese war, especially one with the United States. It is more that just it's possible in the circumstances that it might be forced into that. But ironically enough, in that respect, it's a good thing that China has not helped Russia in Ukraine. I mean, if actually China had been much, much more forward in supporting Russia, then there might be the expectation of some kind of sort of mutual support pact. As is, I imagine that if it did come to a war, Moscow would sort of provide thoughts and prayers, would wave the Chinese on and maybe sort of carry out a few diversionary actions, but essentially would regard that as China's problem.
Mark, official Kiev expressed skepticism over the Chinese peace plan for Ukraine, yet President Zelensky extended his invitation to Xi to visit Kiev to discuss further plans and scenarios. Washington officials, at the backdrop of Xi's visit to Moscow, also suggested that he should put pressure on Putin to end the war. How likely is such scenario at all that it's been kind of talked through? And can China be a meaningful broker of the peace in Ukraine?
Yes, so the Chinese peace plan precisely is, at the moment, I mean, the current peace plan is pointless. It is not a peace plan in any way. But the very fact that that is there and that Xi is willing to talk to Zelensky, and it's interesting how Zelensky, cunning politician that he is, pivoted that into an invitation to Kiev, demonstrates that China has a thought that in the future it may well want to be able to present itself as precisely the peace broker. I mean, from its point of view, it doesn't really care about the war in Ukraine as such. From its point of view, in some ways, this is a win-win. If Putin is able to get something that he can then spin as a triumph, well, then the West and NATO will probably devolve into squabbling about whose fault that was, introspection about where they went wrong and that kind of thing. We've seen it in the past. And that would in some ways create divisions and so forth within the West that is in China's interests. If, as is more likely, ultimately Putin fails in Ukraine, well, then actually his country will be that all the more dependent upon China. So in that respect, it's a win-win. But on the other hand, if China can also be the country that actually is able to broker some kind of a deal, and remember, I mean, China invested heavily in Ukraine, and likewise, Ukraine had become China's greatest import source of corn. So, you know, there are interests at work there. And Beijing is probably more likely to be able to induce or impose Putin to accept some kind of a peace deal that he doesn't like. Well, if Beijing can pull that off, then it very much forwards the Chinese claim that they are exactly a rising global power and a very different one, a responsible and a pragmatic country compared with the erratic warmongering West. So I think, you know, Xi's not going to get involved unless he thinks there's a high chance of success. He doesn't want to get involved in anything that might look as a failure. But I think he's clearly positioning himself that some point in the future, if there have to be talks somewhere, if someone has to convene those talks, China is willing to be the one.
Mark, if we move to the battlefield in Ukraine, this week, Yevgeny Prigozhin allegedly asked Minister of Defense Shoigu for support in Bakhmut. Prigozhin claimed that 70% of the city is under Russian control, but warned that the Ukrainian offensive is upcoming, and he fears that Ukrainian forces can encircle Wagner troops there in Bakhmut. And I wanted to ask you about the bigger picture in light of these statements. Is Prigozhin and Wagner are losing their might in Ukraine and overall influence in the Russian military circles?
Yes, I think they are. I mean, we have to remember that really the high point of Prigozhin's power was actually last year, when there was a desperate need on the Russian side for extra troops. And this is the one thing that Prigozhin could provide in terms of his existing Wagner mercenaries and then the convicts that he recruited out of the prison camp system. They may not be good troops, but they were troops nonetheless. Ever since the mobilization of reservists, which after all brought in some 300,000 additional personnel, actually the value, shall I say, of Wagner has been much more limited. Furthermore, Shoigu, Defense Minister Shoigu, is a subtle and in his own way ruthless politician. For months after months, Prigozhin had used his social media channels and so forth to hammer away at Shoigu, to claim that he was incompetent, a bureaucrat, a traitor even. Well, in part, I think we are seeing Shoigu's revenge in terms of limited access to artillery fire support and such like, and in some ways using Wagner as a, well, let's say a sledgehammer. That's after all a weapon that Wagner is familiar with, to hammer away at the Ukrainians at Bakhmut, with the intention that ultimately it will be defense ministry troops, regular Russian troops, who take the city. Because it's quite interesting that what we're currently seeing at Bakhmut is also a much greater role by Russian paratroopers. So I think this is actually what's happening is that sort of Wagner is being eaten away. It's being used up in frontal attacks on the Ukrainian forces. And I think from Shoigu's point of view, he would not be displeased if the whole mercenary organization ended up destroyed in Bakhmut, so long as it also hands Shoigu a victory in that city. So I think, although it's always dangerous to write Prigozhin off, and I'm sure there are other things he can do for the Kremlin, because this is essentially his role, to be whatever the Kremlin wants him to be. But nonetheless, I think he overplayed his hand in Ukraine in the war. He's currently suffering the damage. And let's face it, he's also politically assailed. His attempts to launch political attacks against Alexander Beglov in St. Petersburg have been rebuffed. The FSB, I understand, is looking into a variety of Prigozhin's businesses. You know, there generally seems to be a sense that his enemies are now clustering around him, and his days may be over. We'll have to just wait and see.
Mark, could you help us understand what is happening around Bakhmut in general? Is it truly becoming some kind of a smoke screen, as it was suggested, for the Ukrainian army to prepare for the offensive elsewhere, despite heaviest losses that both sides seem to be incurring?
Look, the Ukrainians have demonstrated in the past that they're very good precisely at diversionary operations, creating a crisis here to attract attention while preparing for an attack there. On the other hand, there's a danger in assuming that things are being handled too cleverly. I mean, I think what's happened is almost Bakhmut has become a symbolic battle for both sides. In the early stages, because clearly Putin wanted a triumph, and therefore both the regular military and Wagner were desperate to give him that triumph, we saw the Russians taking extraordinarily heavy losses in Bakhmut. And therefore, this was actually a useful opportunity for the Ukrainians to bleed the Russian forces dry. On the other hand, as the Russians slowly did close their grip around Bakhmut, particularly taking the highlands, the salients above the city, well, at that point, frankly, that was when it would have made sense for the Ukrainians to withdraw. Basically to think, okay, well, we've done the damage we can, but given that this is not really a militarily significant city, now let's withdraw. And here clearly there was dispute and opposition within the Ukrainian high command and government. And at one point it did look as if the Ukrainians were going to withdraw, but then they decided no, they were going to be committed. And at that point, what we saw was actually rather higher readiness Ukrainian forces being sent. In other words, more elite troops. And they are taking heavy losses. I mean, the days when, in a way, the Russians were taking several casualties to every Ukrainian casualty, those seem to be over. So now actually what's happening is both sides really have got caught in what one can almost think of as a grudge match over Bakhmut. At present, the Russians seem to be winning. Yes, of course, there's always the scope for the Ukrainians to launch some kind of a counteroffensive, but it actually looks as if it's a distraction for both sides rather than some kind of sort of cunning ploy while the Ukrainians prepare to move somewhere else.
Mark, it's very interesting that in the latest research by Rand Corporation here in Washington on the scenarios of how the war timeline is going to be developing, there is a claim that the modern wars, in the modern wars, territories become less of an asset compared to the wars of the 20th century. And this research states territorial control, although immensely important to Ukraine, is not the most important dimension of the war's future for the United States. We conclude that in addition to a very impossible escalation to a Russian NATO war or Russian nuclear use, avoiding a lone war is also a higher priority for the United States than facilitating significantly more Ukrainian territorial gain. Do you think that this is where the Western paradigm regarding the war effort and its timeline is going to be shifting at the end of the day?
There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, first of all, the point about that it's not really about territory is really important. And again, it goes back to what we were saying about Bakhmut. But actually, Bakhmut itself, if people sat back and looked at it truly logically, does not really matter that much. But the point is, logic seems to have gone out of the window, as is quite normal in wartime. But in terms of this sort of, again, the issue about a quick end to the war, I mean, I think we clearly see that this has become a key Western strategy. They have decided to increase the scale and scope of their military assistance to Ukraine. Particularly, we saw this with the decision to send tanks, and equally important, but much less sort of well heralded, the heavy armored personnel carriers and self-propelled guns needed to create sort of tank-heavy mechanized formations. The idea is that by upping the scale of the support for Ukraine, they give Ukraine the chance to make some kind of decisive military victories on the battlefield in this spring and summer campaigning season. And I think they're probably thinking about, say, perhaps taking Melitopol, but generally breaking the Crimean land corridor, with the hope that that forces Putin to start thinking about some kind of a deal, some kind of negotiated withdrawal, because it begins to make Crimea harder and harder to sustain economically as well as militarily. That makes sense as a strategy. Basically, put all your assets in early and hope that that sort of wins the war quickly. There is a problem with it, though. If it doesn't work that way, if the Ukrainians aren't able to, adapt to the new equipment quickly enough, if the Russians prove to be more resolute and decisive in the defense than they have been in some cases in the past, well, then the danger is actually that the unity of the Western coalition, which after all is providing billions of dollars, euros and pounds every month in assistance to Ukraine, well, that unity begins to fragment, because you'll have countries that really aren't very happy about this war saying, well, look, we tried, that hasn't worked, we haven't been able to see the Ukrainians through to a victory on the battlefield, therefore we need to force Kyiv into some kind of negotiations. So it's a slightly high-risk gamble, but clearly it is the way that the West has decided to go. And that's what basically will make, I think, particularly this summer, so absolutely crucial. Because in some ways, Ukraine needs to demonstrate to the West what could be crudely described as a return on their investment. That all these tanks, all this artillery, all this ammunition and all this money, which is after all keeping the Ukrainian economy on life support, well, that all of that actually has meant something. And therefore, the Ukrainians really need to be able to demonstrate that kind of success before the autumn, I would say.
How, in this context, can we interpret the statement from Pentagon that was just made that American tanks will be in Ukraine by this fall?
Well, this is all part of the sort of the overall campaign to, firstly, support Ukraine, but secondly, also to present an example to the rest of the West. One of the problems we have at the moment is there's a big gap between what is pledged and promised and what is actually delivered. I mean, if one thinks of all these, in monetary values, only half of what has been pledged to Ukraine has actually been delivered so far. And we saw this particularly with the tanks. For a long time, the Germans were resisting the idea of allowing Leopard 2 tanks to go to war. So you had, first of all, the British sending Challenger tanks. And then the Germans saying, oh, no, that's still not enough. We need to see America also being involved. And so the Americans said, although they had some qualms about whether or not actually the big American M1 Abrams is the right kind of tank for Ukraine, but still, in order to break this logjam, they provided them. And so Germany acceded to the idea that Leopard 2 tanks could also go to the battlefield. Well, that was fine, but that was a political statement. And what we've actually seen is that a lot of the countries that made promises are not moving particularly quickly to deliver. And therefore, I think the Americans in this case are pushing forward sending Abrams tanks there, not because they think that this is necessarily a war winner in its own right, but to try and, well, for want of a better word, shame the other NATO countries that have made promises but not yet delivered into getting those Leopard 2s onto the battlefield as soon as possible.